Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study. Thus says the Lord, God speaks through his servants, the prophets. Today we'll be talking about lesson 1 of our study, which covers the first book of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 1 through 28, chapter 2, verse 22 through chapter 3, verse 20, and chapter 28, verses 3 through 19. Welcome to the first Turning to God's Word Bible study in our two-part series on the prophets. As we move through this study, we are going to look at and describe the role specifically of prophets in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah as we progress through the divided kingdom. During our previous study on the United Kingdom of Israel, we saw the establishment of a kingship, and we saw some major figures, including Saul, David, and Solomon. And as we left off, that kingdom had split. Now, instead of having one united kingdom of 12 tribes, we're going to talk about it in terms of the northern kingdom of Israel, which has 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom of Judah, containing 2 tribes. And we'll get into all of that in extensive detail as we move through our study. But first we're going to pause and do a little bit of background. As we talked through the United Kingdom, we focused mostly on the kingship. But we've seen that institution has not 100% been successful so far in terms of the overall goal. Remember, these are the people of God. And I will be your God and you will be my people, is the nature of God's relationship with them. And we've tried a few things now to see how that works. In today's lesson, we'll look some at the first major institution that was designed to help do that, the priesthood, and what happened with that. And then we'll, as way of review, we'll look at how the kingship has been working as well. But the short answer, not to spoil anything, is that neither of those, practically speaking, has worked out very well. Although, theoretically speaking, either one is capable of bringing the people close to God. And we will see that the promise of a good and faithful priest, or a true and holy king, or a good and faithful prophet, in any of those cases has still the infrastructure, the power, the authority, the ability to bring the people into relationship with God. But of course, as we read as Christians the Old Testament, we should see in all of these things the foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. And we see that he is able to be the kind of priest, the kind of king, and the kind of prophet that the people need to bring themselves, or that is needed to bring the people into relationship with God. And that all of these things will be a shadow, and by necessity then a falling short, if you will, version of what is intended by them. And so by way of review today, we're looking a little bit specifically at the priesthood and a transition there, and we're doing it from the context of what role does a prophet play in that. And so we see here in our first passage, always fun to start a new book and a new study, we see a family introduced out of the blue. There's a guy who has 2 wives. That's not that unusual in the Old Testament, although in our church today that would be frowned upon. Back then, not so unusual, and in an extremely common biblical story, one of the wives is fertile and he likes the other one better. But there's a problem in that she doesn't have children, and that really is getting her down. Few other things to mention. The text describes Elkanah as from the tribe of Ephraim, but other sources help shed some light on the idea that he's actually living in the land of Ephraim, but he is from the tribe of Levi, which is a very important distinction if you remember back to the establishment of the priesthood in the book of Exodus. The priesthood, only people of certain birth are eligible for the priesthood. And it's not that you grew up in a moneyed family, it's that you grew up in the tribe of Levi. And so it will not be unimportant as we move through this lesson to note that by birth, by heritage, and by right, then this family count as Levites, even if they live in the land of Ephraim. The one other thing that we want to dwell on here a little bit is that there is this annual practice here of things going on where there is worship in a center named Shiloh. So people go on a regular basis every year to Shiloh to worship. And Elkanah and his family are no exception. This looks very much like, but it's important to note it's different from the later practice of going to Jerusalem to worship the Lord 3 times a year. That was mandatory and is talked about all the way back before this in the Torah. It's mentioned when you get settled in the land and you set up your city and everything, and you're safe from all sides and all of that, then holy city, you're going to go there to worship. This is a sort of a precursor, a foreshadowing of that. And what we see is who's in charge right now of religious practice among the people and really centralized power. At the point we're talking about at the beginning of the first book of Samuel, the kingship has not yet been established. Everybody is doing whatever they want because there is not yet a king in Israel. This is a line paraphrase that comes up fairly often through the book of Judges and around. There's a general pattern of there is no single leader. The priests are generally responsible for the religious welfare and well-being of the people. And when that fails too much, God sends a judge to help. And by a judge, we don't mean like Judge Judy, guilty, that kind of judge. We mean this is a person who's invested with special authority by God of 2 types. There's a political authority that's largely related to military power, much like we ultimately see with the kings, but it's not hereditary. It's a one-time thing only. Somebody's tapped, they're a judge, they help get the people out of trouble, and then they kind of fade into the background. Rather than hugely established bureaucratic whole kingship system. And the second part of it is the judges serve also to relay messages from God to the people, much as we see the prophets come to do. Here, in the first book of Samuel, we're at a turning point. We see the priesthood has largely been the major driving authority entity among the people, and that it has not been working that well of late, we'll see. And the center of that operation now is in Shiloh. The priesthood is centered in Shiloh. The Ark of the Covenant is in Shiloh. People go to Shiloh to worship. So we see this is a normal part of worship that Elkanah and his family are doing. This is how it was working at the time. So we've got a guy with his 2 wives, one of them giving the other one a hard time, and they're routinely in the habit every year of engaging in what is the customary worship practice of the time. So in this section we see another character and a little bit more setting of the stage. The things that happen here happen in the temple, we see. It's important to note, again, for the sake of emphasis, when we say the temple here, we mean the temple in Shiloh, not the temple in Jerusalem. This is before Solomon built the temple that will become the temple that we'll talk about later. This is just some random the temple set up in Shiloh. Not random, it was the center of worship at the time, but it's not the one we really think about when we think about the temple. It's not the one Jesus argued with the Jewish leaders about. This is just, for our purposes, this is a temple and not the temple, although it was the only one at the time. So, as we've seen before, during the annual worship, Hannah and her family are up at Shiloh for annual worship. And this is a sad time of year for Hannah because her rival gets a lot larger of a portion than she does, and it's just kind of a big trip rubbing in that she's barren. And her way of dealing with that when everyone else is partying is not to drown herself in her sorrows or anything else like that, but to head off to the temple and to talk to the Lord. And enter another character who will become important. Eli happens to be at the temple, and Eli is a priest, which is where you would expect to find a priest is at the temple during the festival. Eli is a priest. Hannah is praying, and what she is offering is, God, give me a kid and I'll give him back to you. Which, if you think about it, is an odd request. It shows where her heart is at. I know when I pray for things I really want, my inclination is not, God, if you give me a pony, then I will give it back to you. Right? It's give me a pony so I have a pony. Not give it to me and then I'll give it right back to you and that's fine. Or, a Ferrari or whatever your chosen form of that is. But it's not, God, give me what I want and I'll just give it right back to you and dedicate it to you. It's I want it for me, not this thing is about you. But we see from Hannah's point of view, God, give me this child. Yes, there's a sense in which it would lift some of her shame and reproach. But ultimately, she just wants to give the thing back to God, not to hold it and to keep it for herself. And there's a great lesson for all of us there in how we ask God for things, how we approach Him, and how we look at the things we want. So how is she looking at giving this child back? We should talk a little bit about no razor touching his hair. Brings up a thing that existed in the earlier days of the Old Testament, and then we see shades of again with John the Baptist, called the Nazirite vow, where a person could engage in certain restrictive ascetic practices and be dedicated or set apart for God, including not consuming alcohol, not cutting their hair, and there were some other things. It's a form of setting yourself apart or dedicating yourself to God. That's the big deal in the story of Samson and his long hair. It's not that his hair had magical strength-giving properties when it was long. It's that was part of keeping his vow to God. So that when his hair got cut, it's like his vow to God was broken. And then he lost that relationship with God. And the strength that he has was came to be just symbolic of what comes of having that good relationship with God. And Samson was, of course, a judge. He was one of these people who was in charge of helping get God's people out of a mess that they got into by not following his will and exerting military strength and political leadership for a time to help people get through that. So we're seeing a connection in terms of what's being promised here to at least something in the line of the judges, which is also probably not accidental. We'll see, but it's not. So we've got setting here. Hannah is praying and teaching all of us a lesson in what that looks like if we do it right. Remember, as Christians, we're called to dedicate everything that we have in our lives to God. Not to give Him, the stuff I don't care about, but I really like and want this, so this part's for me. And God, you can have these things that are whatever, that's fine, but, I'm keeping this pony just for me and you, just for me and it, and you don't get any part of that, but, you can come with me to my job and maybe help it not be as bad, or whatever other thing. No, you don't give God the bad parts of your life and try to keep the good ones for yourself. That is, where do you want God with you? How do you want that to be? We need to give God every part of our lives to dedicate and set ourselves apart to God. We see that in the Nazirite vow as a means of dedicating ourselves to God, and we see that in Hannah's prayer, on Hannah's offering, in taking the things she wants most and surrendering them to God. Last point on that, it's not a trade. God's not a vending machine where you put in, God, I'll give you this thing, and then please give me back this other thing. It's not a financial transaction. The gifts from God are not things we can ever fully merit or earn or pay for. They are gifts freely given. And so we should approach him very humbly and keep in mind it's totally at his discretion whether to give these things to us. But if we're looking for them for selfish reasons, that's really going to hurt the chances of getting them. So the two characters we've set up in the previous section, Eli and Hannah, now have a meeting. Hannah is, as we've said, distraught. She has gone to the temple to pray, and she is in the temple praying fervently and seems to be moving her lips as she's doing it. She's just, the image the passage invokes for me is one of she's just all in, like consumed by begging the Lord to help with her problem. And then Eli comes along, and she's acting, apparently it's unusual at this point in time to see someone praying fervently in the temple, which ought to give us a sense of, and the priest is surprised by it, which ought to give us a sense of the general atmosphere. People come to town to worship for the feast, and that worship involves drinking freely and eating it's a vacation, it sounds like. Everybody's having a nice meal and a party. The priest expects people to be drunk more than to be worshiping. And we see instead Hannah there at the temple praying. And it tells us something also, I think, about Eli, that he far more assumes that she's drunk than that she's there to pray. And although he scolds her for it, she sets him straight, and he then is left with, oh, okay, well then God give you what you want, whatever, yeah, that's fine, and prays for her as well. And note at that point is when, yeah, we'll see what she does, but that seems to be the end of the exchange here, and despite Eli's expectation here, it is his weighing in. He is still priest, and she's still just Hannah. And so it's still, I think, an important part of this that even so, his praying for her as well becomes an important part of what happens. Which, not to spoil anything, but she has a child, which we're about to see, but that's kind of implied. That's kind of a no-brainer that that's what's going to happen here, and we've all heard the story probably, or most of us. So, but it's worth reflecting some on how she's been praying fervently and diligently, and then she has this encounter, and she's been praying for years. This happens every year. You have to assume this was pretty much a habit for her, that she would come in and pray to God about the situation when she was here. And this time she meets Eli, who then prays for her as well. So something changes, and we'll see if she gets a different result. So whatever we might say about Eli and the priesthood, even yet in this lesson, it's worth noting this is the thing, it seems that God takes his prayer seriously. The institution of the priesthood is still very important, whether the particular individual is always worthy of it or not, which is again a thing for us as Catholics to keep in mind. We have seen in our church, unfortunately, a decent amount of scandal about the individual character of some of our priests. And that is, of course, deeply distressing for all of us. But it is helpful for us to keep in mind the man and the institution are not necessarily the same thing. And the institution is sacred and profound, and God honors that, what that is. As he does here with Eli, he does also in our church today, even if not everyone is necessarily worthy of that. So, at any rate, Eli chimes in and joins Hannah in her prayer and prays for her. It was a lucky encounter for her, and by lucky I mean ordained by God and blessed for both her and God's people. So, as we just talked about, and I probably spoiled a little bit too much in foreshadowing, Hannah has her child. And she does what she says. She had said, God, if you give me a kid, I will give the kid back to you. And we see, she was not specific about the details when she was praying before, but after her encounter with Eli, and his becoming involved with the situation. She seems to have decided that the version of that isn't just that she's not going to take the kid to get a haircut, but instead that she's actually going to drop him off at the temple and say, Eli, here is the child that you helped me pray for, so here, have him, basically, but not quite. I think we should not overlook that this wasn't exactly usual behavior even back then. We're perhaps a little colored by the fact that later in Christian history, it became not entirely uncommon to drop a child off at the steps of a monastery, so to speak. But back then, this was not a common thing to do, to have a child and then to just give the child to, drop him on the steps of a monastery. It's an unusual thing, and you see she and her husband actually talk through and work out, how are we going to do this? This is what I have in mind. The husband has a legal right to the child and the child's future and what all of that means. It's not just, although they certainly do love their son, it's not even just that. There are other things at play that they have to work out, because again, not exactly a common practice. But they talk through it and they're okay with that, and they do it. An interesting thing that we see that's worth thinking about is the language used of she lent the child to the Lord rather than giving. Big difference. This is, of course, not like I would lend someone my car. It's a big deal in that Samuel is going to be the Lord's for his entire life. It's a weird thing to think of as lending. And there is something built into the Jewish law, or Israelite law at the time, that I think helps us make some sense of that, which is when the people came into the promised land, everyone got their heritage. So you have land reserved for different tribes, and then within that you have subdivisions, and everybody basically has their family parcel of land. And even if you sold that, in theory, at the end of every 7-year period, that land reverted to be yours and your family's again. So that the selling of your land was only a lease. It was never, you couldn't transfer your heritage. I think we see something similar here with this child, Samuel. When Hannah lends him to the Lord, she's not giving up her claim on him or her heritage through him. She's only giving use of him for a period of time equal to his lifetime to the Lord. So she's basically saying, God, thanks for the kid. Yeah, this is still my kid, but you can use him however you want to. So she's keeping possession and heritage and giving over to God use. And to build on a theme for how we should look at these things in our own lives. Maybe I'm the only person involved in this video in any way, shape, or form whatsoever who ever has problems with finding a place for autonomy in my relationship with God and finding it weird. I have to give myself over entirely, and what's left, and what does that mean for my identity, and some of those questions that potentially come with the idea of total surrender to God. But what's highlighted here is she 100% retains ownership and right to her child, and it's only the use that goes to God. It's kind of the same way with our own possession of ourselves, is we retain an individuality and identity as self, and we only give over use of it to God. And so I retain heritage through myself, but I give over use of myself and everything that I am to God as He made me. And if that happens to merit a better heritage for me, so much better. But it is, in that sense, our relationship with God is not unlike what happens here. It is a leasing or a lending of ourselves to God for our lifetime, and hoping that He takes good enough care. Maybe He'll want more after that. So anyway, things to think about. But Samuel goes to live with Eli is really the important textual development here. Eli has come to live with Samuel. Now we're going to skip forward a little bit, a thing that we will be doing more in this study than any of our other studies except the Psalm study, which jumped around to follow the church calendar. But throughout this study on the prophets, we will be working to include as many sections from the writings of the prophets as possible and along with their narrative, which means there will be more jumping around between different texts. So we will have that to look forward to, and it will indeed be fun to get to dig in and read some of the writings of the prophets. Here, we're doing it in the interest of review. We're kind of hitting the high points to make sure we have the background we need about what a prophet is to move appropriately into doing that. And so here we are at a point of transition. Samuel has come to live with Levi, with Eli, not Levi, although he is of the tribe of Levi. And we see Eli in his age, some time has passed, is getting reports about the behavior of his sons. Not about Samuel, but about his sons. And they're not behaving so well, or well at all. And there are a few things we can kind of imply about how the priesthood is going from that. There might be a few people who are upset about what these no longer super young men are doing, but there seems to be enough widespread acceptance of their behavior that tells us that the priesthood is not on a good track here. And the familial relationship between Eli and these boys, and the fact that he seems to not have that good of an idea what their daily life and practice of the priesthood looks like, as their dad, but also in a sense their boss. And that, he just seems kind of oblivious and everyone seems to be tolerating, suggests that the priesthood really is on a bad track. And so what we've been looking at here in the beginning in terms of review, we've got Shiloh set up, we've got a sort of temple built, and the Ark of the Lord is there. And we're going to see God has said, we're done with this institution of the priesthood, and this city, and this temple, and this Ark. We don't need any of that, it's not working. I'm going to do something to these people, we have to make a change. If you think about it a little bit, in terms of where we left off talking about the United Kingdom and the kingship, God's people seem very comfortable in the idea that they're going to continue to be God's people, and He's not going to let anything bad happen to them, because after all, the Ark of the Lord is in our city, and it's a city of God where we worship, and God established the kingship to take care of us, and we built a temple here, the temple of the Lord, and so God will never let anything bad happen here to the people or to the kingship. So as we're setting up for that, it's really good to keep in mind there's precedent that is exactly what God will do. Because what is it that He wants from us? He wants to make a great and a mighty kingdom that's feared through all the earth. Oh, no, wait, no, that's not God. He wants to call us into relationship with Himself. And if we're not doing that, He doesn't care about the other things. Back then and in our lives now, God doesn't care how successful I am at my career if I'm never praying and have no relationship with Him. And He may very well use that area of my life as a wake-up call and take away from me the things that are distracting me from Him so that I can get back to my roots, back to basics, and find Him again. God doesn't care about anything in our lives or in the kingdom of His people other than that complete relationship with them and with us. And He is not going to He's not going to say, oh, but Matthew, look, he goes to Mass and he's such a good Christian, so bad things shouldn't happen to him because that would make God look bad. I think sometimes that mentality still exists a little bit in our church. So when we think back on Shiloh and on the behavior of these unfortunate priests, we should keep in mind there is precedent for what God does in a situation where people are not on the right track and are not in relationship with him. And he has no problem with taking things we think are sacred and firm and are so good and in service of him, and saying, well, let's just get rid of all of that. And, what would really help draw you closer to me is some suffering. And so God is here making a change. And there's an especially interesting comparison because the failure of the priesthood is personified in the biological children of Eli. And here there's one who is added on, who is not the property of Eli. He's still the heritage, so to speak, of Hannah. And he came from somewhere else, but he's growing up in this same household. God is adding someone on into the same chain, but not from it, and onto the side of it, and saying, I'll keep this thing that's not actually by heritage connected to the priesthood. I will connect it to the priesthood, and then I will draw from that the things I want to keep about the priesthood, and we can just leave the rest of this. And so Samuel is going to be a hugely important transition point here. He's sort of grafted onto the priesthood, and then the whole priesthood is cut off from him, and he keeps carrying on. And we see that Eli's sons are going to be, and family and line are going to be part of what is cut off because they're not getting the job done. So, building on the theme of the demise of the priesthood as the prevailing institution in Israel, and the emergence of the role of the prophet, we see a man of God come to Eli, voicing certain complaints. If you think back to the last passage we just talked about, what was the major complaint? It's probably enough for the sake of this part to remember that it was sex related, and what we see here from the man of God is not. So, not the same complaint. And in fact, an escalation. And a call to remember how the priesthood was established and what their job was. God plucked out a tribe of people who had shown particular zeal for serving only the Lord and gave them special rights and privileges, and in exchange asked from them things. So the priests offered sacrifices. The general rule, there were different types of sacrifices, and without going into a lot of detail, the general rule was the best parts of the sacrifice are given to God, and the other parts you get to keep and eat as a priest. And so you get free food as part of your role as priest, which is a pretty good deal, except in the case of Holocaust, sometimes you burned the whole offering. But even the offerings that were like grain and wine and these animals, most of the sacrifices involved bringing something to eat to the priest. The priest would give some of that something to eat to God and then eat the rest of it. And that was permissible, and that was the arrangement. The Levites didn't have land of their own as being pulled apart and dedicated to God, so they didn't have the means of providing for themselves. So it was sort of a trade. The people provided for the priests, and the priests, in a spiritual sense, provided for the needs of the people by providing the means by which the people are reconciled to God. And it was a mutually dependent and beneficial relationship. What happened here, the criticism is the priests were cutting out doing their part of it, making atonement to God. They were taking from the people, but they weren't giving back their part. They were taking the good stuff that was God's and keeping it for themselves. And they were essentially then not returning. They were supposed to be the conduit to God for the people. The people were coming to the priests and it was stopping. The conduit wasn't getting to God. So they broke the chain of communication and relationship that was their responsibility. That is a lot Not that it's a good thing, and priests should not be going around sleeping with prostitutes. I am definitely not saying that that is a thing that should ever happen. But this other thing is far worse, because their fundamental function has broken down. The whole reason the priesthood was called and established, what they were supposed to do, they are not doing. And they don't have the ability themselves to see it. Someone has to come in from the outside. Eli was able to get himself at least a little worked up over his sons too publicly sleeping with prostitutes. But this other thing he had no concept of. God had to send someone in from the outside. The perspective, the perception of the priests has been so warped by their failure to do what's right that they can't even notice. And no, it's Eli's sons who are sleeping with the prostitutes. This other thing, Eli is being included in the condemnation here. They learned this from him. So it's everyone. So priesthood failing, God has decided, has said, again, you all think you're secure because, I promised that you could be priests and that I'd always have priests going in and coming out before me. God will arrange it so that that's true, but they don't have to be them. So these guys don't have to be those priests. There is a need for the function that was established in the priesthood, the ability to offer sacrifice to pay atonement to God. But there is not a need for the specific implementation of it that is a bunch of guys taking what belongs to God and sleeping with prostitutes instead of, leading the people to God. It turns out, even in most places in the real world, if you have a particular job that someone commissions and pays you to do, and then you decide to not do that and to do whatever you want, you're probably not going to keep that job that long. These guys kept it for generations because God, as it turns out, is very patient. But at the point that he saw no way, that no amount of corrective action or performance plan was going to get these guys back on track. It was time, and God is very much about at-will employment. It was time to move along, and these guys are done, and it's time for a new plan, which we'll see he starts setting up here through Samuel. But Eli and his family, the claim, God, but you promised, or but you put me here, is not enough to guarantee that things stay that way. So we see a little bit of an odd transition here from the priesthood is doomed and all of you are doomed, and doom and damnation, to Samuel's having weird dreams. And if we're not thoughtful about why these things are happening, or we miss some of what's going on, this seems like a little bit of a disjointed transition here. But again, if we connect the idea that God has connected Samuel into the heritage of Eli, and he's planning to get rid of all the non-Samuel parts of that, and move on with what he was wanting the priesthood to do through Samuel, then it's not so unusual. It's important now to establish Samuel and Samuel's authority. And that it comes from Eli, which is exactly what we see happening. Samuel is sleeping in the temple. Again, not the temple in Jerusalem or heaven. Neither of those temples, but just the one in Shiloh that we've seen is about to be no more. But it's still the religious center. And he hears a voice that he is confused by. He thinks Eli is calling him. We will, through this study, be moving into a period in the history of these people where it is not at all uncommon for, although it's certainly not an everyday event or for everyone, but it becomes a normal part of the people's relationship with God, that some people hear the voice of God and speak on his behalf. But here we've been in a period where that is so unusual that when someone does, someone who has been growing up in the temple, in the company of priests and presumably being trained as a priest. We see he acts as one later, so we can, and he is by birth entitled, so we assume priest in training, at least in Samuel, and we see he is confused as well. And he's a good and holy guy. He's not the two sons who are not getting it done. He's a good and a holy guy, and he's confused by hearing the voice of the Lord. It is so unusual for anyone to be that connected with God at this point of time. Nobody knows what he sounds like. The people have forgotten the voice of God. They're so far away from God that they're going to need to, again, learn to hear the voice of God. And how does that work? Samuel, confused, goes to Eli, who is still the priest. He's still the one whose job it is by institution and by office to be able to figure this out, and he does. Eli seems to have a sense of what's going on and kind of guides Samuel along a little bit. So God is still using the institution of the priesthood that he's about to get rid of as established to move on to Samuel here from Eli. Eli recognizes what's going on and helps Samuel learn to recognize the voice of God. Though Eli himself can't hear it, he still knows vaguely what it sounds like and has a sense, this thing that in my sin I can't hear and isn't coming to me, by my office I still have a sense for what it is and should be. So I can recognize that this is the voice of God, but I don't get to hear it. Whereas Samuel gets to hear it, but we're still in a place here where we're seeing a transition from Eli to Samuel, which is what happens here. Eli teaches Samuel how to recognize the voice of the Lord. And so we see Samuel finally does recognize it's not Eli who is the religious authority who's talking to me and calling me to something, because that doesn't work. It's God is going to talk to me directly. So we thought it was coming from the normal channel of Eli, but we're getting rid of that, and God is going to talk directly to Samuel, and we're going to do something through that. I won't anticipate too much. We'll get it in this lesson later in this video, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So we see the institution of the priesthood in that old sense fulfilling its last major task in teaching Samuel how to recognize the voice of the Lord. And now it's Samuel's job to teach that to the people again, and to set up an institution that will be more faithful to that. Although that one will have its own challenges, we're moving forward into something else. So we're building on a theme. God gets Samuel's attention and starts telling him what's about to happen. Specifically, he's going to do a thing in Israel that's going to get everyone's attention. And what he says that thing is and what it means are very important, and what it means is far beyond just what he says. And by now, hopefully, we've done a good enough job building our understanding of the factors leading up to this, that this should be pretty obvious. He's getting rid of the priesthood in the form that it was in. And why is he telling Samuel? Because he's moving on. And it is going to be very shocking for people to see the priesthood isn't God's end-all, be-all thing. It's going to get a lot of attention from a lot of people when God doesn't protect the ark and the priests who live in the city and allows destruction to rain down on them. But it's because that form of that thing, that's not what God's doing now. So he's changing the way the people relate to him in order to accommodate the fact that the system that was there wasn't working. There's a question that some of us might ponder when we think about that, which is a question very worth thinking about. God, being all-knowing, knew this priesthood system wasn't going to work from the beginning, So why didn't he just set up whatever we're about to do after this, the kingship, first? Why did he set up a thing that he knew would not work? It's a fun thing to think about. We see as we talk about salvation, as it is ultimately won for us by Jesus, it uses the reality of the institution of the priesthood as it works as an institution. People who are capable of offering atonement for the sins of the people under very specific conditions and are given the power and the authority to do that. We see that Jesus uses this institution of the priesthood in a very particular way to effect salvation, just as he will use the fulfillment of the institution of the kingship and the highest form of the idea of what is a prophet. And all of those things joined together in the person of Jesus Christ allow for what God is really trying to do, which is creating the infrastructure that does allow people, all of us, to have access to salvation and to eternal life in him. And we need all these parts. So we're going to go through a little bit of a cycle here of God doing things and then seemingly move on. But the infrastructure he set up never disappears. There are still priests in the days of David and in the days of the divided kingdom. And even after the people return, he has not gotten rid of all priests. What changes is he's gotten rid of priests having political authority. The priesthood as a class pretty much never again are the rulers of the people. Although they seem to think that they're the rulers in the region at the time of Jesus, they have to bow to the Romans and the non-Jewish king of the region to do anything deeply substantive. So they like to think they're in charge, but they still are basically just religious leaders in an educated class who are a little too self-important at the time of Jesus. They're never here. They were in charge. The priesthood as an institution, this was what determined what the people as a whole did. Even who they went to war with. Policy governing pretty much they set policy, they took military action, they set laws. This was the thing. And from this time on, that will never again be the thing. Because that political authority conflicted with their ability to do the job that God wanted them to do, he took away the thing that was conflicting. He took away the political authority and left just the duties of sacrifice. Power corrupts, and God did not want his priesthood corrupted by that power. So we've got to find another way to deal with the need for power. Because people still need to be, somebody has to be in charge, or we're going to have chaos. It can't be priests. It could be Moses, it could be Aaron, it could be Joshua, it can't be Eli. And it definitely can't be Eli's sons. It can be Samuel. And we see through Samuel's lifetime that it doesn't say Samuel either. Samuel is here as kind of a hinge, as a transition point. He holds the power that the priesthood held long enough to redistribute it as God sees fit. And in that sense, he acts as a priest, he acts as a judge, he acts as a prophet. He does not ever act as a king, but he makes kings. He has power. He anoints 2 different people king. He has power over even who is king. He basically stands not in the place of any of these individual institutions, but in the place of God to reshape the whole structure, political structure of these people, and to prepare the way for whatever God has in mind. He doesn't, at this point, even know what that is yet. He knows God is going to do a thing, and everybody is going to be talking about it, and we'll hear about it. And so we stand here at a moment of transition. So now that we've seen God is going to make a change and talked a little bit about what that looks like and how that hinges on the person of Samuel, we're going to once again take a jump forward a little bit and look at how that plays out a little bit more. Remember, Samuel has, as a prophet, the authority to make kings, and more than that, he anoints Saul, the first king of the people of Israel, and David, the second king, when Saul is not getting it done. And he serves as a corrective. He tries to get Saul to stay on the right track and keeps trying to tell him what's going on and what he should be doing differently. And when Saul disregards and decides not to listen to the Lord via Samuel, it was through Samuel that Saul spoke to God. Saul didn't speak directly to God. When Saul decided to disregard that, then Samuel just stopped serving as that intermediary, cut off Saul, and went and found someone else to be king, David. So we see at the establishment of the kingship, Samuel holding as the office of prophet, executing God's will and bringing this about. And it's worth going back just a step to how this set up and mentioning that for a while, Samuel, again we saw, had all of that authority himself. He was, like the judges, an administrator and a military leader who also spoke with the voice of God. And he is the last of the judges as we move into kings here, and that is because he also fundamentally fractures the role of judge. He splits it in two. While he's taking political authority away from the priests, he also takes the role of judge and makes it two different things, so that the kings carry the administrative side of that, and we see an emerging role or office of prophet, who is someone God speaks to directly, as he started again speaking to the people through Samuel. And it's basically a direct representative of God, who's not bound by any of these other sources, any of these other powers. God sends, he acts, he speaks God's words to the people. He speaks to the king, but he also speaks directly to the people. We'll see as the role emerges. And there's precedent. If you go back all the way to Moses, what was one of the first things Moses did? Let my people go. He spoke to the Egyptian king on behalf of God. So we see there's precedent for prophets speaking to kings and also trying to encourage the people to get right. But Samuel has not only helped to achieve a political shift in the nature of the priesthood, but he has also changed the role of the judge and defined kingship and prophets. So it's really in the person of Samuel and in his life that we see the threefold roles of priest, prophet, and king defined as they continue to be for the remainder of the time until Jesus redefines them again. And so Samuel very much sets the stage for Jesus and foreshadows in the structure of these three roles what it is that he is going to do. In this passage, we see Saul is really down on his luck, and there's going to be a big battle coming up, and he really wants to know what's going to happen. At this point, Samuel is dead, but that isn't going to stop him. So he decides he needs to speak to God. And again, he can't do so directly. So he has to find an intermediary. He finds one in the form of a medium, but kind of has to go the long way around here. Like, I have this audio device and this thing I want to plug it into, and I have these 8 adapter cables, and none of them is the right one to just connect them to the two directly. So I need to chain all these different things together to get the message from one place to another. He's sort of doing that with intermediaries here to try to speak to God. He goes through the medium to get to Samuel to get to God, is kind of what he's trying to do here. Because he knows that Samuel will speak for God, but he has the problem of A, Samuel doesn't want to talk to him, and B, Samuel is dead. So he finds somebody who can at least get past the dead part. He's still going to have to deal with the he doesn't want to talk to him part, which we'll see presently. But kings don't have direct access to God, is what we see here. And he needs, in this case, a number of different channels to try to find out what God's will is in this situation. So Saul, in dire straits, set upon by the Philistines, is extremely eager to talk to God and to find out what he should expect. There was a pattern of king's about to go into battle. He asks the prophet, who asks God. God tells them whether or not they should fight and whether it's going to go favorably. And that's kind of what he's looking for here. But he had a bit of a falling out with the Lord when he didn't really seem to care and didn't want to listen to other instructions. He was happy to listen to the parts that got him military victories, but the parts where he then didn't do everything else exactly the way he wanted to, he didn't want to hear. And so it turns out, and I think this holds true in our lives as well, that you don't really end up in a very good situation if you only want to listen to the voice of the Lord when it is things that aren't going well for you, or things that are directly to the benefit of what you want, regardless of whether or not you're really strongly relating to God. If I only listen to God when it comes to what lottery numbers to play, and then, but what I do with the rest of my life, I want to do however I want to, that's probably not going to work out very well. But it's only a very slightly exaggerated form of how Saul is treating this situation. And he is pretty much, by that metaphor, calling Samuel back from the dead to tell him what the winning lottery numbers are through a medium. And Samuel is as upset by that as he would be if that's exactly what was happening. And he says, I already told you what was going to happen. You didn't listen to God. You're doomed. The people are going to lose this battle, and God's going to take the kingdom out of your hands and give it to somebody who's actually going to want to love and serve the Lord, and not just maybe have some military success here or there, or winning lottery numbers. So we see again Samuel, even in the afterlife, speaking on behalf of God. And the afterlife here, not as we would think of it as Christians in our world today. Heaven has not been opened by Jesus yet. So Samuel is in purgatory, we can guess, some sort of holding area in the area of the dead, waiting for the doors to heaven to open. Even Samuel, who did really everything God asked him to, was a really stand-up guy, still not in heaven yet. And also just as crotchety as he was when he was alive. We can see he's really, why are you bothered? He has all time to be dead, and he's still bothered by the inconvenience of having to talk to Saul. And why on earth, at this point, does he care who wins the battle? He's really kind of beyond such things at this point. So maybe you can kind of relate as well to, he's wondering, why on earth am I having this conversation? Which, fair enough. So, but we see the relationship of the prophets to the kings, which is going to stay important, which is why we wanted to focus on making sure everybody, we all had in the front of our minds going into this study and seeing how these things progress, how this works. The kings don't have power over the prophets. It's the other way around. The prophets speak to, correct, etc. the kings, because the prophets speak for God. It's God's power that they get to directly exercise. The king is someone exercising political authority, is really exercising earthly power that comes from beneath them, from people listening to, right? If people didn't listen to the king and pay taxes and take orders, the king has no power. It's a power that ultimately comes from beneath them by the consent of the people. That's not true with the prophets. We'll see the prophet's power comes from above them. It comes from God. It doesn't need anyone else's buy-in or say-so or consent. A prophet can murder, for example, 300 false prophets of a false god, and nobody has to really do anything other than just stand there and be amazed. The power comes not from everyone agreeing, yeah, we think Elijah should win this contest today, or we think anything else. It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks or whether they give their consent to what is happening, because it's not that kind of power. It's power that comes from God. And in the relationship between the prophets and the kings, we see the power that comes from God meet the power that comes from the people. And ideally, those things merge and marry well, to the point that you really don't even need the prophets, and the king can serve as that intermediary. But that's not understanding that power corrupts. God has isolated that administrative power from religious institutions as much as possible. And then he has put religious checks with his own authority on the behavior of that institution that was kind of designed, I think, by God to isolate corruption and to try to preserve as much of the people in the religious practice as possible free from having to worry about that. It's not the same as our separation of church and state, but it follows something of a similar idea of, if we know this part is inherently corruptible and corrupt, then let's set up a structure outside of worship that contains it, so that when it gets corrupt, we haven't also turned our worship rotten. And then let's set up another structure to check that, and that is God acting in the world through the prophets. And so we've got, and we'll see the remainder of this study will be seeing how that plays out. It will be God acting through the prophets on the increasingly corrupt structure of the kingship, and trying to track how the people get affected in all of this. Because ultimately God cares about the people, not the kings. The kings are kind of a necessary evil as we try to navigate through an increasingly complex geopolitical situation without getting just completely wiped out. But there will be lots of neat things to look at as we see the development of world politics. We see the people pitted against each other. We see good kings and bad kings, and lots of outside influences and forces. We see the kingship, in many cases, as we already saw, Solomon showing is what's likely to happen, collapsing under its own weight. And we see the interplay between all of these things, and that is our prophet study, as we see the role of the prophet as assigned by God is the anchor through all of this. It's the thing that remains uncorruptible. And although there are false prophets, that's not the same as a true prophet being corrupted. The prophets called by God remain the single voice of and manifestation of God guiding his people through this tumultuous time. And through the study, we will trace how that goes and how that works. And we'll watch the people evolve, change, grow, and move ever more in the direction that we as Christians know this is moving, which is towards Jesus Christ. This has been an overview of Lesson 1 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. Thus says the Lord, God speaks through his servants, the prophets. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.